What if Carol's story was never about confusion, duty, or silence? What if the truth was simpler and harder to accept? What if Carol is in love with Zosia, but doesn't even allow herself to say it out loud? Once you see the signs, it becomes impossible to unsee them. On the surface, Carol's relationship with Zosia looks ordinary. They share time, space, and history. Nothing about their connection is clearly romantic. There are no clear love confessions, no dramatic gestures, no moments where Carol openly admits desire. And that is exactly why most people stop looking any deeper. The story appears settled. Carol cares, Zosia matters, but love, that feels like too strong a word, or so we are told. But stories are not built only on what characters say, they are built on what characters avoid. And Carol avoids something very specific whenever emotions rise. Whenever Zosia becomes vulnerable or distant, Carol changes. Her tone shifts, her choices become strange. She acts before thinking or freezes when action is needed. This is not how someone behaves when they are calm and certain. This is how someone behaves when something inside them is fighting to stay. Hidden, if Carol only cared for Zosia in a simple way, her reactions would be steady, predictable, safe. But they are not. Carol reacts as if something important is always at risk, as if losing Zosia would mean losing more than just a friend. This tension follows her quietly. It never explodes. But it never leaves either. It stays in the pauses, in the unfinished sentences, in the moments where Carol watches instead of speaks. What makes this more interesting is that the story never tells us Carol is confused. We assume that ourselves. The story never says Carol is unsure of her feelings. It simply shows her acting like someone who cannot afford to be honest, and that difference matters. Confusion feels noisy. Carol is quiet. Her silence feels controlled, almost trained, like someone who learned long ago that certain feelings should not be touched. Zosia, on the other hand, moves freely. She speaks more openly, she questions, she pushes. And every time she does, Carol pulls back. Not because she does not care, but because she cares too much. Carol's restraint is not coldness, it is protection, not just of Zosia, but of herself. Because once a feeling is named, it cannot be undone. This is where the surface story starts to crack, because if Carol truly felt nothing beyond friendship, there would be no need for this level of control, no need for distance, no need for emotional caution. Friendship does not demand silence, love does not, and the story knows this. That's why it never gives us clear answers. Instead, it gives us discomfort. It gives us moments that feel slightly off, conversations that end too soon, looks that last too long, decisions that make sense only if Carol is trying not to feel something she already does. The surface story says, there is nothing more here. But the subtext keeps whispering, there is, and it's dangerous. And that whisper is where the pluribus theory begins. The pluribus theory is not about one clear answer. It is about many small truths existing at the same time. In this kind of storytelling, emotions are not spoken directly. They are divided, hidden, and spread across actions, silence, and choices. A character may not say, I love you, but the story still allows that love to exist in pieces. This theory works best with characters who are emotionally controlled, afraid of exposure, or shaped by rules they did not choose. Carol fits this type perfectly. According to this theory, Carol does not experience her feelings in a simple way. She does not wake up one day and realize she is in love with Zosia. Instead, her feelings appear in fragments, a moment of concern here, a strange reaction there, a choice that feels too personal to be accidental. None of these moments are strong enough alone to prove love, but together they create a pattern that cannot be ignored. Carol's actions towards Zosia are rarely neutral. Even when she tries to act distant, her behavior shows attention. She notices changes in Zosia before others do. She reacts faster when Zosia is involved. She becomes tense when Zosia pulls away. Even if nothing serious has happened, These are not habits formed by routine friendship. These are responses driven by emotional attachment that has grown deeper than Carol allows herself to admit. The pluribus theory suggests that Carol is not lying to others. She is lying to herself. Her mind separates her feelings into acceptable parts and dangerous parts. Care is acceptable. Responsibility is acceptable. Protection is acceptable. But desire, longing, and emotional dependence are not. So her love breaks apart and hides inside safer emotions. What we see is not the whole truth, but pieces of it scattered across the story. This explains why Carol often looks calm on the outside but feels heavy on the inside. Love that is denied does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes tension. It becomes control. It becomes fear of making the wrong move. Carol is not afraid of Zosia. She is afraid of what Zosia awakens in her. That fear shapes her behavior more than any clear intention ever could. Another important part of this theory is repetition. Carol repeats the same emotional patterns again and again. She steps closer, then pulls away. She helps, then withdraws. She shows care, then hides. This cycle only makes sense if she is trying to manage something strong. People do not need this much effort to manage simple feelings. They need it when emotions threaten their sense of safety or identity. Zosia becomes the center of this struggle without even trying. She does not need to demand attention. Carol gives it automatically. Even when Carol is focused on other things, Zosia remains present in her decisions. This quiet gravity is one of the strongest signs of hidden love. Love does not always shout. Sometimes it bends everything around it without being seen. The pluribus theory does not claim that Carol wants a romantic relationship in a clear or traditional way. It claims something more subtle and more painful. Carol feels something she cannot name, cannot place, and cannot remove. So the story lets that feeling live in pieces, in looks, in pauses, in choices that feel too emotional to be logical. When we watch Carol through this lens, her actions stop feeling confusing. They start feeling protective, careful, afraid, and love, when denied, often looks exactly like that. When we focus on Carol's behavior instead of her words, a different story begins to form. Words are easy to control. Actions are not. Again and again, Carol's actions reveal an emotional pull toward Zosia that goes beyond reason. She changes her priorities when Zosia is involved. Plans shift, risks increase, logic bends. These are not small adjustments. They are signs of someone who places another person above their own comfort without openly admitting why. One of the strongest signs appears in moments of danger or emotional pressure. When Zosia is at risk, Carol's restraint disappears. Her movements become faster, her decisions sharper. She does not pause to measure consequences. This matters because Carol is usually careful. She thinks before she acts, but around Zosia, that careful nature breaks. Love often shows itself when control slips, and Carol's control slips most clearly when Zosia is threatened. There is also the matter of jealousy. Even when it is never named, Carol reacts when Zosia gives attention. Elsewhere, not with anger, but with withdrawal, she becomes quieter, more distant. This is a common response for someone who feels replaced, but does not believe they have the right to feel that way if Carol saw herself only as a friend. This reaction would not carry so much weight. Friendship allows space, love fears distance. Another pattern appears in how Carol watches Zosia. She observes more than she participates. She notices moods, changes in tone, small shifts in behavior. This kind of attention is intimate. It requires emotional investment. Carol is not watching out of habit. She's watching because Zosia's emotional state matters deeply to her. Even when Carol says nothing, her focus speaks for her. What makes this even more telling is how Carol treats others in comparison. Her behavior toward Zosia is different, more patient, more intense, more personal. She does not offer the same level of emotional presence to anyone else. This contrast is important. Love often reveals itself not in what is done, but in who receives special care. Zosia is clearly set apart. Carol also shows a strong need to protect Zosia from emotional pain, not just physical harm. She avoids hard truths. She softens her words. She carries emotional weight alone so Zosia does not have to. This kind of protection is exhausting. People do not choose it unless the other person holds a central place in their heart. It is not obligation. It is devotion. Even if it is unspoken, silence plays a major role here. Carol often chooses not to speak when speaking would expose too much. She ends conversations early. She changes topics. She leaves before emotions rise. To hide, silence becomes her shield. But silence can also be a confession. It suggests there is something she is not ready to face, even privately. Through this pattern of action, reaction, and restraint, the story quietly builds its case. Carol's love does not appear as romance. It appears as sacrifice, as vigilance, as emotional labor that never asks for recognition. This is not the love of someone seeking reward. It is the love of someone afraid of consequence. When all these behaviors are placed together, they form a clear emotional shape. Carol may never say she loves Zosia. She may never allow herself that clarity, but her actions already have. And actions, unlike words, rarely lie. The strongest proof of Carol's hidden feelings is not found in what she does, but in what she refuses to do. She refuses to speak honestly when honesty would bring relief. She refuses to ask questions whose answers she already senses. She refuses to cross emotional lines even when the moment quietly invites her to. These refusals are not signs of emotional emptiness. They are signs of restraint. And restraint almost always protects something valuable. Carol's silence is carefully chosen. It appears in moments where emotional truth is close enough to be felt. When Zosia opens up, Carol listens, but rarely responds with the same openness. Not because she does not care, but because responding would mean revealing herself. Silence becomes her safest option. In this way, the story uses quiet moments to say what dialogue never does. Love, when forbidden or feared, often learns how. To hide in stillness, visual distance also plays a key role in how this emotional truth is shown. Carol is often placed just slightly apart from Zosia, not far enough to disconnect, but not close enough to relax. This in-between space mirrors her inner conflict. She wants closeness, but fears what closeness would unlock. The story repeats this distance again and again, turning physical space into emotional language. There are also moments when Carol almost breaks, small slips where her control weakens. A look held for too long, a reaction too strong for the situation. A pause that feels heavier than words. These moments pass quickly, but they matter. They suggest that the truth is always pressing against the surface, waiting for the wrong moment to escape. Carol is not emotionless. She is disciplined. Another important element is denial. Carol never directly denies loving Zosia because she is never directly asked. The story avoids that confrontation on purpose. Instead, denial exists internally. Carol chooses explanations that feel safer. She calls her feelings responsibility, duty, or habit. These labels help her survive without facing what she fears most. But false names do not change real emotions. They only bury them. This internal struggle gives Carol's story a quiet tragedy. Love that is never acknowledged does not fade. It stays active, shaping decisions from the shadows. Carol's life becomes organized around avoiding pain rather than seeking happiness. This is why her choices sometimes feel heavy or incomplete. She is not moving toward what she wants. She is moving away from what she fears. When viewed this way, the story becomes less about whether Carol and Zosia will ever be together, and more about whether Carol will ever allow herself honesty. The tension is internal, not romantic in a traditional sense. It is about identity, risk, and the cost of emotional truth. Zosia represents not just love, but the possibility of change. And change is often more frightening than lost by the time. All these elements are considered together. The question shifts. It is no longer, is Carol in love with Zosia? The real question becomes, how long can someone live while denying what their heart already knows? The story never answers this directly. It leaves the weight with the viewer. And that weight, lingering and unresolved, is perhaps the clearest sign that Carol's love was always there, quiet, divided, and deeply real. Carol's emotions toward Zosia reveal themselves most clearly not in words, but in her actions. Every choice she makes carries an undercurrent of care that goes beyond simple friendship. When Zosia faces challenges big or small, Carol's attention sharpens. She notices subtle changes in Zosia's expressions, the tone of her voice, or even the way she moves through a room. These small observations may seem insignificant at first, but they are pieces of a pattern that reveals someone who is emotionally invested on a level deeper than what is socially acceptable or safe-o. Are her to admit the intensity of Carol's care becomes more obvious when she prioritizes Zosia over herself, whether it is offering support at the expense of her own time, ignoring her personal needs to protect Zosia, or intervening quietly to prevent Zosia from harm. These actions show a dedication that goes beyond friendship. Carol does not act this way for casual acquaintances or even close friends. She does it for Zosia. Her choices consistently put Zosia at the center of her attention, suggesting that her feelings carry weight she cannot or will not express in words. Another key aspect of Carol's behavior is the subtle ways she manages Zosia's emotions. She softens situations, deflects tension, or even takes responsibility for emotional burdens that are not hers to carry. This protective instinct is rarely performed for anyone else, which makes it stand out. It is a type of emotional labor that requires conscious effort, patience, and, above all, care. What is striking is that Carol performs this labor silently. She does not seek recognition, and she rarely allows Zosia to see the depth of her involvement. This quiet devotion is a hallmark of hidden love, where actions speak more powerfully than words ever could. Even in neutral or casual settings, Carol's behavior toward Zosia is distinct. She leans in when Zosia speaks, lingers in moments that might seem trivial, and often observes before acting. These small but consistent behaviors demonstrate heightened awareness and emotional sensitivity. Love, when it is unspoken, often manifests in attentiveness. Carol's pattern of noticing, anticipating, and responding to Zosia's needs reinforces the idea that her feelings run deeper than ordinary friendship. Tension is another revealing factor. When Zosia interacts with others or expresses interest in someone else, Carol's reactions are carefully measured. She does not lash out or display obvious jealousy, but she withdraws slightly, tightens control over her emotions, and reassesses her behavior. These reactions suggest an internal conflict. Carol is aware of her feelings, but she restrains them, navigating a boundary she cannot cross without risking exposure. This restraint itself becomes a subtle signal of love, because indifference or friendship rarely produces such complex emotional calculations. Carol's pattern of protective behavior also highlights her long-term emotional investment. She remembers small details, anticipates Zosia's needs, and takes actions that reflect forethought and planning. This is not casual attentiveness. It is the kind of behavior that signals emotional attachment that has grown and deepened over time. Even when Zosia is unaware, Carol's actions reflect her commitment to her well-being. The consistent prioritization of Zosia's happiness and safety illustrates a bond that is more intimate than most friendships allow. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Carol's actions is the emotional energy they require. Maintaining this level of care and restraint is exhausting. Carol does not openly express relief, joy, or desire. Instead, she expends emotional energy managing her feelings and the consequences of acting on them. This type of emotional effort is rarely required in platonic relationships. The intensity and precision of her care suggests that something powerful lies beneath the surface feelings that she cannot verbalize. but which inform every interaction she has with Zosia. Finally, Carol's behavioral patterns indicate that her love is not performative. She is not trying to impress anyone or seek validation. She is responding to her own deep-seated emotional truth, even while denying it consciously. Every act of protection, attention, and vigilance is performed out of genuine concern, which makes it all the more telling. The quiet, unacknowledged love embedded in her actions is perhaps the clearest evidence that Carol's heart is already committed to Zosia, even if her lips remain silent. This consistent, layered devotion, expressed through deeds rather than words, forms the core of the pluribus theory. It demonstrates that love does not always announce itself boldly. Sometimes it exists in the subtle, almost invisible patterns of care that a person repeats day after day, quietly shaping their world around the one they hold most dear.